Hi, and welcome to the House of Meditation. We have a saying that we do before we open our retreats, and I thought that it might be appropriate to say it here as well. Time is fleeting. Do not hold back. Make life your treasure. Namo Buddhasa. Namo Buddhasa. Namo Buddhasa. Let us celebrate the liturgy of the day. Let us share the peace. May all beings awaken to that peace which is our true home. Let us take refuge. I take refuge in the ground of being, within which I live and move and breathe. Let us make the accord. I take sanctuary in the heart of being, accepting all of my delusions in thought, word, or deed, born of ignorance, hatred, and greed. Let us give thanks. I give thanks for all things, awakening to the interbeing of all nature. May my heart be open and my mind clear. May all be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and may all come to know that peace which is born of insight and understanding. Since it is the practice of enlightenment, that practice has no beginning. And since it is enlightenment within the practice, that realization has no end. Welcome, everyone. Tonight's talk will again be a part of my newest book, The Three Principles of Oneness. The back section of this book is entirely made up of questions that people have sent in to me. It's called Ask Sensei Tony, and it was based on a column that I used to do. So our theme for each talk is a question that someone has asked me. So the reading for tonight comes from Sir James Jeans. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Sir James Jeans, which is unfortunate. But he was one of the most prominent physicists of the early 20th century. And his name is attached to a lot of astrophysics discoveries. And there's even a measurement named after him for measuring, big cosmic cloud star systems. So he's a very important character, but he was also a very influential writer. So this is one of his quotes. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We are beginning to suspect that we ought rather to hail it as the creator and governor of this realm. It may well be, it seems to me, that each individual consciousness ought to be compared to a brain cell in a universal mind. Sir James Jeans. And again, remember, this is being written in the very early part of the 20th century. So the question tonight was, what is the Buddhist view of the universe? Excuse me. What is the Buddhist view of the universe? So I want to start out by saying that the views that people have of the universe are always to some degree limited by their understanding of how things work. So, going back thousands and thousands of years ago, early peoples were fascinated with the stars. They were fascinated with the planets, the moon, and a lot of our stuff, even to this day, is based on their insights and their understanding. However, they were limited in their understanding of what was actually going on. So early astronomy became astrology. It was a way for people to kind of relate what was going on in the sky to their own personal lives. And much of the mythological framework of theologies was created, and you might even say that most early theology was kind of an astro-theology, and it was based on star systems, and even the deities were often named after these different things. So humans have always had a tendency to project onto nature what was going on with them. So as we move forward into what would be known as the beginnings of the scientific age, so to speak, even right around that period, we'll start with the medieval period and the rise of the scholastic method, which is still used to this day when people write their thesis or their dissertation. But it was a way of understanding the universe. And during the medieval period, they were pretty much obsessed with the idea of spheres. And to some degree, that idea of spherical thinking came from also their growing exploration of the meaning of music, and particularly as music ascended from there into the classical period. So the universe was, at that time, often divided into spheres. And then whenever humans began to, really focus on clocks and clockwork and time and measuring things in that sense, then another thing arose, which was then they began to kind of look at the universe more like a clock or a machine, seeing how all the different parts fit together and how it, how time passed and how the seasons passed and how that related to everything. And then whenever the steam engine was created, using fire to create steam, to push trains and other modes of industry, then the universe began to look like that. And even the laws of thermodynamics, to some degree, you could say were related to that period. And then, of course, in more recent times, the universe has been looked at in computer ways, particularly with the ideas of, the computer or the universe possibly being a simulation, like a video game. The reason I mention all this is because it's important to realize that science, what we call that knowledge now of how things work, it's always human. As hard as we try to be objective and create some kind of reality out there apart from us, it really isn't true. Now that's not to say that we can't create some kind of objectivity, but we should note that even our objectivity is often a projection of things going on with us. So I just thought that was a good kind of way to start. So the question is, what is the Buddhist view of the universe? Well, Buddhism is different. No matter who you talk to, whether it's an academic or it's a pop writer like someone like Sam Harris, anybody who really studies Buddhism will quickly come to the conclusion that it's very different. It's very different from any other human faith tradition. And part of this is because it is based upon empiricism. So the thing that Buddhism today, or science today, shares with Buddhism is the idea of empiricism. Buddhists are taught to be skeptics, not cynics, and there is a difference. A skeptic is someone who is always questioning things. That doesn't mean they don't believe anything, or it doesn't mean they don't make certain assumptions, but they're always willing to question those assumptions. And they're always willing to allow for new information to change the way they think. And so in that sense, science shares a similarity with Buddhism. And Buddhists are taught to only accept a proposition after examining the evidence. And the Buddha is very famously recorded as having said, don't trust something just because some sacred authority tells you, or it's in some book, or some authority of any kind tells you. Whatever it is, you have to learn it for yourself, test it in your own life, and see if it works. If it does work, then proceed. But if it doesn't, reject it. So that's a pretty unique position for a spiritual system to have. There was an ancient method, in fact, that the early Buddhist community came up with, especially as they became organized. And it was called the recursive argument. And the recursive argument is a forerunner to what I mentioned earlier, the scholastic method. And you can, some scholars argue that the early idea of a university or college, in fact, was created by Buddhists. That they were the first known in history to organize in that way. And that their schools taught all these various different levels of education and insight about how things work and why they matter. And it was from them that you might say that when during the so-called Golden Age of Islam, when Islam was in places like Baghdad, was the center of learning in the world, a lot of that had to do with the things that they had taken from the Buddhist communities, and they had copied them to a large degree, including some of their concepts, like the concept of zero, which is an Arabic term, is related to the Buddhist idea of shunyata. So it's a kind of fascinating history. And in many ways, great early Muslim thinkers who were probably less religious, so to speak, and more oriented around knowledge, like Averroes and Avicenna, a lot of the information that they were able to save made its way into Europe. And you could argue that without them, the European development may not have happened. But the Europeans took the recursive method and things of that nature, turned it into the scholastic method, and then that eventually found its way during the early period under people like Sir Francis Bacon and things like that, that they developed this empirical method. So Buddhism is very empirically oriented. And I would go so far as to say within Buddhism that you must test it for yourself. If you don't find that it's something that's working for you, don't worry about it. You might at some further point. But the foundation is that you should work with those things that work with you. So I think that's very important, because when we talk about Buddhism, Buddhism's emphasis is on the relief of suffering. I mean, that's its main reason for being. And it has always placed wisdom over knowledge. And that's a very important thing to say, to be clear about. It's always emphasized wisdom over knowledge. And this emphasis is because knowledge is always being predicated by varying levels of sentiency. In other words, our ability to perceive how things work is always limited to some degree by varying levels of sentiency. And so, there's always going to be an ongoing opening of knowledge, where knowledge is never going to be set. For two reasons. One, based on exploration and our technological abilities to explore. But secondly, by our level of sentiency and how much we can actually perceive. So for that reason and many others, it's always emphasized wisdom over knowledge. There's a famous parable called The Two Arrows. And it's basically a story of a person who's wandering down through the woods on their way to market. And there is a Buddhist priest falling behind on their way to market as well. And what happens is the person in front of the priest, an arrow comes out of nowhere from the woods and strikes the person in the thigh, and they go down. And so the priest rushes up to the side of the person who's been wounded and says, I'm a Buddhist teacher, I'm a healer, I can help you. And the guy that's been hit says, well, that's great, but before you do anything to help me heal, I need to know who shot it and why. And the Buddhist teacher said, I'm sorry, man, I don't know. Looks around, I don't know who shot it and I don't know why, but I can help remove the arrow. And then that story is further explicated in the sense that when we are wounded by something, It's two wounds, really. The first wound is like getting hit by the arrow. But the second wound is all the thoughts and beliefs we attach to why we got hit by the arrow. So Buddhism has always sort of emphasized focusing on that pragmatic level. Remove the arrow and help to heal. Explanations about why certain things are and all that sort of thing. It's not that Buddhists didn't, kind of go into that realm and discuss that, but they always said that that's secondary to this relief of suffering. So I think that's very important to be clear about. Okay, so now let's go into the early cosmologies that Buddhists have kind of dealt with and kind of shared. Now, in some sense, some of these cosmologies share similarities to some of our modern scientific understanding today. Some of them are eerily similar. And so, why that is, the explanation has always been that when one investigates the nature of the mind, and the view of the mind is something that is unlimited, then it's believed that as a person's sense of being awakened, or their sense of awareness grows, that kind of information is available to us. So, going back to that story around the arrow, the Buddha argued there is no apparent rational necessity for the existence of something like a creator God. Now, I want to be clear about this because there's a lot of subtleties to this. When the Buddha is recorded as saying something like that in the sutras, what he was saying was that the idea that people have in many different cultures of a being, maybe a supreme being, who sort of made everything, is something that Buddhism doesn't require. And that it's always found other ways to explain the universe. Now, like I said, all cultures had them. In his time, Indra was the name of the creator. And Indra is a parallel to Zeus. And in some ways, a parallel to Yahweh, and a parallel to various ideas of creator beings. Now, what's interesting about these creator beings that supposedly created the universe is they don't seem very, at times, much more than big humans. In other words, they seem to have the same passion and folly as other human beings, but they're just super powerful and super big. So when the Buddha was saying that we don't rely upon that, he wasn't saying that there might not be a creator. He was just saying that for his emphasis on the relief of suffering, it wasn't necessary. And furthermore, when these things were sort of explicated and discussed further, there were different ways to talk about it. I mean, the emphasis was always on the idea of interdependent origination or causation, that everything is interconnected, and that everything comes from everything else. So the idea of there being something out of nothing is something that Buddhists would, on some level, not agree with. Now, on some philosophical level around the idea of emptiness or shunyata as sort of being the spaciousness with which all things exist, sure. Much like the concept of zero that I mentioned earlier. What is zero? Well, you can say it's nothing, right? But if you want to have advanced integer mathematics, you have to have zero, or you can't have negative numbers. So what is zero? So in that sense, Buddhists would say that everything comes out of nothing. But the idea of ex nihilo, or the idea that there was a deity that suddenly brought everything into being, that's something that they would agree with historically. And the idea being that everything has come from something. There is a sutra called the Agana Sutra, or Agana Sutra. And in there, the Buddha is presented as sort of laying out a model of what Buddhist cosmology might be. Now, scholars debate on whether this was actually the Buddha Shakyamuni saying this, or it was a Buddhist community who later wrote these texts and were sort of using the Buddha as a figure to speak their own stuff through. And that was a common practice in ancient times. We don't know. The Buddhists seem to practice more of the idea of being like, that's not important. So when people would ask him, when did the universe begin, when will it end? He would kind of like just say that's not important to the relief of suffering, going back to that original idea I mentioned. However, in the Agana Sutra, there is a story which actually became very powerful and very influential in the world. And I'll say why that is. In that, the Buddha seems to present a model of cosmology wherein the universe expands and contracts over extremely long periods of time. And this description has been found by some to be consistent with the idea of an expanding universe. And further, it might sort of involve the idea of the Big Bang. Now, a lot of scientific cosmology has gone back to the point of singularity or the Big Bang as the starting point, but everybody kind of wondered what happened before that, right? And some folks like Sir Roger Penrose of Oxford have theorized that this universe came out of another universe, that before this universe there was another universe. Well, that's exactly what the Buddhists believe. That this universe came into being from another universe, based on the idea of interdependent origination or causation. So there's an interesting parallel. I mean, in Buddhist cosmology, there's also always been extra dimensions and other planets and aliens. So it's very sci-fi when you read things like the Lotus Sutra or the Abhidhamsaka Sutra. It reads more like a scientific, or a science fiction rather, novel than it does what we're kind of used to in reading about religious texts. Now, there was one thing in there that that he does talk about, and again, supposedly he said, and again, I would say that most Buddhists today would take this more as a fable or more as a sort of teaching parable. But in this story, it says that there was a period where consciousness, that everything in a way, and I want to be very clear about how I say this for people, is that consciousness is something that is the ground nature of the universe. So the Buddhist belief is that consciousness is everything, and that without consciousness nothing else exists. And it's very similar to Sir James Jean's quote, that the universe is actually manifested from consciousness and not the other way around. And when you look at it this way, the story that is told is a story that can be taken as a fable or a story to kind of parable to teach us something. A lot of scholars think that this, what I'm going to share with you in a moment, was actually the way that Buddhists were teaching to counter the caste system. Because in this cosmology of the origin of human beings, it upsets the classic caste system that was set up by the Rig Veda and texts of that nature in the Indian culture. So there is the idea, and again, how you work with this can be either as a fable or a mythological story that helps explain maybe something real, but does it in a fantastic way, or a way that's limited by a certain amount of knowledge. But here's how it goes. So if consciousness is the ground nature of everything, from this ground nature, everything else emanates. And when I'm saying everything else emanates, I mean everything. Everything emanates from this ground consciousness. And sometimes this ground consciousness, which is sometimes like in Tibetan is called Rigpa, there is a Buddha, or what's called an Adi Buddha, or a primordial Buddha. Now again, this isn't taken literally, but a Buddha by the name of Samantabhadra, who represents symbolically the ground nature of the universe, of consciousness. And out of this ground nature of consciousness emerges all things. And it basically sets up the idea that consciousness goes from a very complex situation into a less complex one, and then emerges into another form altogether. And this idea, so basically that the consciousness that become human devolved from higher beings. That when this emanation first occurs, there are beings who exist in a formless sense, where they are more like just consciousness. And then they become drawn into different time-dimensional vortexes, and then in a sense, their consciousness of these beings becomes trapped somewhat, you might say, in the evolutionary cycle. Sounds like a cool science fiction story, right? And that the idea is that once they get trapped in that, and they're drawn to that because of wanting to have this experience that's different from the one they were having, that then they as a part of jumping into that new experience, they lose their memory of what they were originally. And so then it requires that other beings who come along, like the Buddha, to show them how to wake up and remember their true nature, right? But it does put it into that kind of science fiction framework, which I think is a lot of fun. And when you look at the idea of the Buddhist understanding that time is a never-ending cycle, in which worlds are created and destroyed and created by the law of karma, or cause and effect, that in these cyclical universes, there's no beginning and no end. And when intelligent life is talked about, it's talked about more in that sense of this idea of these beings that were formless and then become formed and then become something altogether new after that experience. So it's basically spiritualizing evolution. Now the reason I mention this as being important is because this mythology or this fable influenced the ancient Western world. And by saying Western world, I mean the Greeks and the area of the Levant, or we would call today the Middle East. And it became known as Gnosticism. And Gnosticism penetrated and made its way into Plato and later great Greek teachers like Plotinus. And it also made its way into the Gnostic Christian movements, the Gnostic Jewish movements like Philo of Alexandria. And it also made its way into the development of Manichaeism, which was the prophet Mani, who combined Buddhism and Persian ideas like Judaism to create a new religion, which was at one time so big that it almost usurped Christianity. Manichaeism or Manichaeism almost usurped Christianity. In fact, the great Christian teacher, Saint Augustine, was originally a Manichaean, or a Manichaean. And he took a lot of his ideas into Christianity and had a huge influence. To some degree, the idea of original sin and things of that nature were based on these Gnostic concepts and ideas. So when you think about it that way, these Buddhist ideas, even the mythological ones, had a huge impact. So I just wanted to kind of give that survey to kind of show that, you know, on the one hand, Buddhists have always been humble and say, look, you know, we're here to relieve suffering. The origin of the universe, end of the universe, all those questions, they're secondary to this. We don't even need to know those things. We don't need to know who shot the arrow or why. We can remove the arrow and heal and lead a good and happy life without that. But then they would go on to speculate what might have actually been. So that brings us to today. So when someone says, what's the Buddhist view of the universe? I'm speaking today for me, and I would say my community to some degree, on our opinion about this subject. And my opinion is that whatever knowledge we have about the universe or how things work, that we should rely on tools like science to understand it. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean that we should rely on science to tell us what to do, or even necessarily how to do things. Because to me, that's more about why things matter, and that's wisdom. So I always think that science, as important as it is as our way of talking about how things work, should always serve wisdom. And it should always be in that order. When we look at the universe as Buddhists, and we believe that the universe is like a mind, or the emanation of a cosmic mind, interestingly, there's a lot of ideas in current scientific theory and discovery that reflect those Buddhist ideas. And in fact, in this newest book of mine, the first chapter is almost entirely about that relationship. But let me give you one example. There's many that I find interesting, especially when you take the Buddhist idea of the universe being an emanation of consciousness, or a great cosmic mind, which we call Buddha, and the idea that Sir James Jeans was postulating from physics about each individual consciousness being compared to a brain cell in a universal mind. So a lot of similarities there with Buddhism. Now here's an interesting thing. Excuse me, and this is a theory that was put out not too long ago. It was based on the latest research and technology available to us by the way that we can now view the great expanse of the universe and the galaxies. So here's the thing. The basic premises by these scientists is that the universe appears more and more like a large brain. And this would be completely consistent with the Buddhist idea, that it appears this way. And let me tell you how it appears this way, because it's pretty fantastic. So, despite the human brain and the known universe being somewhere around 27 orders of magnitude apart in scale, which that's big, right? Despite that, the brain and the universe show a common composition. That this cosmic web, this is their words to describe the universe, is similar to the levels of complexity and self-organization that you find in the brain. The brain contains an estimated 69 billion neurons, while the observable universe is composed of at least 100 billion galaxies. And these galaxies, much like the way our brain is sort of organized with relation to the neural networks, that they're strung together, and this is what I thought was really interesting, they're strung together loosely like a web or beads. And I thought, oh, well that's one of our main symbols of what the mind and the universe is like. And these are two Italian scientists who are putting this out there in a peer-reviewed journal. And they go on to talk about how both actual galaxies and neurons only account for about 30% of the total mass of the universe and brain, respectively. And both galaxies and neurons arrange themselves like beads on a long string of cosmic filaments. And there's actually a Buddhist parable about this called Indra's net. Now, in the case of galaxies, the remaining 70% of mass is now what we call dark energy. Right? And that just means it's invisible. It means we can't see it. We know it's there, but we don't fully understand it. But we know that it makes up roughly 70% of the universe. Well, guess what the parallel is exactly in the human brain? Water. 70-30. It's exactly the same. And further, the idea is that just as life on Earth arose from water, the universe arose from dark energy. I don't know. I thought this was pretty cool. There's a spectral density of both systems that can be calculated. And this is a technique, I'm reading some of it from the journal. This is a technique often employed in cosmology for studying the spatial distribution of galaxies. Our analysis showed that the distribution of the fluctuation within the cerebellum neuronal network on a scale from 1 micrometer to 0.1 millimeters follows exactly the same progression of distribution of matter in the cosmic web. The scale's different, right? But it's the same. And they go on to say that the clustering and number of connections emanating from each node in the brain and each galaxy in the universe were oddly the same. And I'm quoting one of the authors, Vaza, one of the scientists. Once again, the structural perimeters have identified the unexpected agreement of levels and connectivity within the two networks, which have evolved following similar physical principles, despite the striking and obvious difference between the physical powers regulating the galaxies and consciousness which regulates the neurons. And here's something else around that. They're now beginning to use this relationship both ways, so that even the way that they're understanding this cosmic web is now beginning to have an influence on how they understand the brain. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I find that absolutely fantastic. I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? I mean, and what's so wonderful about it to me is that it's so clear that the oneness of the universe is a fact. And it further, explicates that as we learn more, I think we'll realize that consciousness is fundamental to any view of the universe. And it truly is all one. It is truly interconnected. I could go on and on. I could spend the evening giving you different examples, but I thought that was a pretty cool one to share tonight. So, what is the Buddhist view of the universe? That. Contemporary Buddhists like myself, that's my view of the universe. And I just want to finish by saying that as much as I love science as our current form of how understanding how things work, I want to go back to that earlier statement that is so important to me because I love science and I love the scientific endeavor, that we have a certain caveat in place and realize that science should always serve wisdom, and that we have to be very careful and realize that when we look at things, including the stuff I talked about, that projection can be involved as well. So there's always a humility there. But science, and it's not just today, it's been going on for quite a while. Science often is used for propaganda. And science is often politicized. And that's because science starts to become dogmatic. And that's because science starts to be put in some kind of place as a religion. And in my opinion, that is completely wrong. Because once you do that, then how things work is now in the lead, not why things matter. And knowledge must always serve wisdom. I'll finish by two lines from the Tenzin Gyatso, the current 14th Dalai Lama. He says two things. Number one, that if we discover something in science that completely and empirically refutes a Buddhist teaching, then we must let go of that Buddhist teaching and accept the scientific. Can you imagine a pope saying that? And secondly, it is all too evident that our moral thinking simply has not been able to keep pace with the speed of scientific development. In a troubled world, being guided by science, but insisting that it reflect human values, and that knowledge must always serve wisdom and not the other way around. So in other words, while this knowledge can serve as something vital to us, two wings of one bird, it must always be understood in that order, in that relationship. So I hope that was a decent, quick answer to how do Buddhists view the universe. The moment we receive true and trusting, solid and clear like a diamond, infinite light and life embrace and protect us, liberating us completely. Let us take together the four immeasurable vows. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. Delusions are endless, I vow to end them. The ways of compassion and wisdom are boundless, I vow to embody them. The way is unattainable, I vow to attain it. Let us share the precepts for the community of the Bodhisattva's vow. I allow my true self to manifest in all aspects of life. I take complete responsibility for my own life in all of my actions. I affirm my personal being and acknowledge it as a path to awakening and freedom. I embrace all aspects of my personal being, including my shadow, so that they may be transformed. I affirm an attitude of openness to my true self, even in the midst of suffering. We will now make our offering of incense, and we shall chant together. Tonight we will use the Heart Sutra mantra. So I encourage you to do so at your home altars. And then when the offering is done, we will have a period of silent abiding. Gate, gate, pera gate, 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 bodhiso, gate, gate, pera gate, pera sangate, bodhiso. Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate 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 Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate 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 Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate 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 Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate 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 Bodhisattva Gate Gate Pera Gate Pera Sangate Bodhisattva Pera Sangate Knowing that we never practice alone or just for ourselves. Let us offer our life and labor in wisdom and mindfulness by reciting together the Bodhisattva's God. We dedicate this practice to the welfare of all beings throughout space and time. May it always be so. Namo. Yes. Namo. Namo. This concludes tonight's service. Thank you, everyone here and everyone out there, for joining us. Just a reminder that if you are seeking personal guidance in life, that's what we do. You can contact us through the AskSenseiTony.com website. And there's an email there that you can contact me by, or here on Facebook if you want to message me. You can do that as well. If you feel called to helping others to be relieved from suffering, we also have a 20-year-old training program that is very cool. So consider that too. And if you're looking for a spiritual home, please consider joining our community. Blessings.